has a theory about how development economics works. You must follow the way. To the extent that you follow the way, your country will prosper. To the extent that you fail to follow the way, your country will languish. The way is divided into 3 commandments. Thou shalt enact real land reform. Thou shalt protect infant industries and enforce upon them export discipline. The author is supremely confident in his conclusions, considering them proven by history. He takes us on tours of Asian countries to show us the wonders that await the faithful and the failures of those who strayed from the way. He does not, however, expect us to take his prescriptions on faith. He explains why there is no other way but the way, shows how each divergence leads to ruin. At each step of development, he has a model for what is going on, whether or not he quite describes or thinks of himself as having one, and all 3 models fit into a unified model of how to think about developing countries. It also implies a lot about the developed world, along with other interesting consequences, but he never mentions this. My guess for why is that they are not conclusions he particularly likes. From here on in, except where stated otherwise, I'll be stating the book's perspective rather than my own, and what seem like its implications. Let's take a look at the model's components, starting with the first one, agriculture. Land reforms. The model goes something like this. In America, farms are big. Really big. No, bigger than that. Farms are big. Labor, on the other hand, is expensive. Thus, we build our agriculture around being able to get a reasonable crop out of a large amount of land, rather than trying to maximize the yield on a farm of a given size. In most other places, farms are small, and land is often a limiting factor. In places like Japan and South Korea, every inch of available farmland is in use, so it is vital to maximize yield on that land. If you get good farm yields, you can export food to generate precious foreign capital, whereas if you get bad yields, you need to import food, eating up the money you need to spend on industrialization. The question is, what determines yields? The thesis of this section is that intensive, motivated labor is the most important input, with proper tools and equipment a distant but vital second place. In order to get the most out of land, you need to know it inside and out, and be willing to work tirelessly day after day. You need to know where you can plant multiple crops at once, and when to weed them and how to scape them so they will both grow, and how to rotate them to never waste a day. You need to work to improve the soil, to rest and renew it, to learn new techniques. The hourly rate on all of this is, shall we say, not great. But it is also non-zero, and there aren't any good alternative ways to turn your hard work into money. Traditionally, the land in villages is mostly or entirely owned by the rich. These rich then rent out the land, or hire laborers to work it for them. Either way, this creates at least 4 problems. The first problem is that the poor workers are not properly motivated to maximize the crop, because even assuming they keep a portion of the crop, they are paying a tax, often 40% or more, to the landlord. What you sell, they'll give you a terrible price for, since the local rich dude, likely sporting a villain mustache, is a monopsony buyer. The second is that they have even less incentive to maximize next year's crop by learning about and improving the land. Why work hard to improve someone else's land? If you make it thrive, they reap the benefits. Third, you won't have the right equipment, tools or fertilizer. You can't afford it. Even if you could afford it, you'd be paying to improve a crop you have to pay a huge tax on, so it wasn't worth it. And if you are short on funds, the only way to get more is to borrow it, at 100% plus yearly interest rates, from the local rich dude with the mustache. Loans usurious. They have no chance to escape the trap, and will never be the producers of the surplus the country needs, nor the savers, spenders and consumers that are necessary for the next stage in the plan. The good news is that there is a solution, land reform. Land reform is a simple idea. You take the land, and you give it to the farmers. This tends to be unpopular with the rich dudes with the mustaches. You offer them compensation for the land you took, but it is in the form of money. You pay it out over time at a rate of interest far less than inflation, and it was already much less than land typically is sold for, so mostly you are just taking the land by force. In this world, the poor are always broke, always on the verge of starvation. Their crops are taxed, their profits cheated, they are understandably upset about this, so the landowners do everything they can to stop you. They will try to keep as much land as they can, and the best land, for themselves. Where that does not work, they will do their best to deny the new owners what they need to survive. They'll buy their crops at bargain basement prices, lend them money for equipment and tools, and money for simple survival when the money runs out, at usurious rates, and cheat in every way you can think of, to get the poor to sell the land back to them. By default, the rich will succeed. Even without most of the land, they'll still have a lot more wealth and power. With no margin for error, every year is an invitation to disaster. One by one, the new owners will fall on hard times and have to borrow, or sell the land back. Once they start falling behind, it gets steadily worse. Because of this, the government needs to do more than just land reform. It also needs to make sure the new owners have a whole support infrastructure in place. They need buyers to ensure a decent price for their crops, irrigation and fertilizer for their land, a tractor they can share, new higher quality seeds, and other neat stuff like that. Otherwise, you fail. For example, Meiji Japan tried land reform without enough secondary help, and it worked for a while, but by World War II the old owners had back most of the land. With enough help, the result is self-sustaining and rapidly pays for itself. With their own land to work and improve, and the tools they need, yields double and triple. Even in places where land reform mostly didn't work, there are pockets. He looks at one in the Philippines where it succeeds because an NGO or other source steps in and provides that help. Soon everyone is not only not starving but has a surplus that creates a domestic market for your new industries, and savings and exports that will be your sources of hard currency. Land reform also has the side benefit of killing support for a communist revolution. Since communist revolution is the actual worst thing that can happen, that is a pretty great side benefit. This already has lots of interesting implications. Huge, if true. Industrialization in the How Asia Works model. Industrialization is fragile and requires careful guidance. By default, you will do all the wrong things, because the most short-term profitable things to do don't lead to long-term success. Long-term success depends on developing the skills and knowledge to compete on the international stage, and not rely on foreigners for the highest value parts of the production chain. The problem is that this is a long-term project, and it will lose money for a while. The first step of the way is to protect your infant industries. The book says everyone has always done this. England, America, and Germany are the prime examples outside Asia, and the book claims there are no exceptions. Without protection, your first attempt at a product will suck and no one will buy it when they could import something instead, so you have no market, no profits, not even reasonable feedback loops for learning, and you never get off the ground on your own. Instead, all you do is make your labor available to foreigners who will run the factories, keep all the vital knowledge to themselves, and also keep most of the profits. Now that you have protected yourself with tariffs and used land reform to create a rural surplus, you now have a captive domestic market for your goods. That starts with textiles because they are low skill and can actually be competitive, so everyone always starts with textiles, but the quicker you move beyond that, the better. They will need your cars, your steel, your widgets of all shapes and sizes. This provides the incentive necessary to build a factory that produces crappy cars and another that produces crappy steel, so you can learn how to make cars and steel that aren't as crappy. By granting an oligopoly the right to produce for the domestic market, and giving them access to low-interest loans, you make sure that production happens, and soon you have captains of industry. The problem is, captains of industry do not want to be captains of industry. That sounds like a lot of work, and not that much profit. Sure, they will happily use foreign expertise to sell their crappy cars and crappy steel to a protected domestic market. That part sounds great. But learn how to compete. For real. Invest in the future. Why do that when you can make a quick buck and use it to build casinos and luxury condos? In cases where these seekers of rent are allowed to do that, that's exactly what they do. Don't get me wrong, I like a good poker game and I love me a good luxury apartment, but they are not the path to industrialization and a modern economy. On a fundamental level, they don't produce anything. They are consumption goods, without the positive externalities you are looking to compound over decades. A smart government, therefore, will make sure that doesn't happen. In exchange for the right to sell to this captive domestic market, the captains need to invest in the future. The government will decide what industries and technologies are important, and guide them, using the levers of finance and regulation to force compliance. The captains must take on the projects of vital national interest, even if the returns are not as good. Year by year, they must use more domestic inputs, even if they need to develop those inputs themselves. They must use every deal as a way to get the foreign devils to give you access to their technology, and you reverse engineer everything you need and learn to operate it on your own, even if that slows you down. If you don't understand it, you don't do it, period. Remember, you are getting massive subsidies from the government, so doing things the hard way is survivable. Most importantly, they must be subject to export discipline. Export discipline is the magic that makes all of this work. If you don't have to export, you never get the feedback on what the consumer market wants, and you never stop producing crap. The Soviets learned this the hard way, and never learned how to produce consumer goods. But if you make the exporting a condition of the massive, and oh boy are they massive, subsidies you are throwing at these captains, they will sell their products overseas no matter what. They will take a loss, They will find no one wants to buy, even then, and they will ask why, and they will learn. They will iterate. And over time, they will figure out how to make something that can compete. Other countries will of course try to tell you that this isn't fair, and you can't be doing this, but you just don't listen to them and you do it anyway. They won't be happy, but they benefit enough from trading with you that they'll put up with it. The companies that can't or won't export, you cut off from the free flow of cheap money. They die. Thanks to export discipline, together with massive subsidies, Japan, South Korea and Taiwan learned what the global market wanted, and figured out how to provide it, reaching the technological frontier in the places their governments led them. At this point, you have a Sony or a Samsung, and you can, mostly, let them find their own way. Think of the model as saying that some investments have massive positive externalities for the country. The captains of industry won't capture those gains, so they will make choices that are right for them but wrong for you, the same way that the most twirling lords of the countryside were. Doing things that were good for them but horrible for the country. Once again, you must force them to do what you want. Using massive bribes everywhere, and outright coercion when necessary, e.g. General Park of South Korea showing he was willing to throw his capitalists in jail if they didn't do what he wanted. You can correct the incentives, point them towards your country's long-term needs, avoid the easy paths that don't have a future, and be on the road to success.